Okay, so in part A, we looked at the monopolist decision with respect to output and price, and we said that the monopolist will compare marginal revenue to marginal cost. Where those two are equal, that'll be the quantity that they'll provide to the market, and then we go up to the demand curve and over to the price axis to pick up the price. And then when we compare the monopolist output to the output we'd expect to get in perfect competition, what we notice is that the output under monopoly is going to be less than the level of output in perfect competition. And when we compare the prices in monopoly to the price we expect to get in perfect competition, the price in a monopoly market structure would be greater than the price in perfect competition. Let's talk now a little bit about whether or not the monopolist will make an economic profit. And again, the answer to that question, like a lot of questions in economics, is it depends. Well, what does it depend on? It depends on what the average total cost is in relationship to the price a monopolist will charge in the market at the output level. So again, remember, we're going to call QM the output level because that's the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We're going to call PM the price because that's the price that we get if we go all the way up to the demand curve. And if we assume that the average total cost at QM is below the price, then the monopolist would make an economic profit. But just because a person has or a company has a monopoly does not guarantee them that they're going to make a profit. One good example I can think of, real life example, is Tesla. Okay, you could argue that Tesla has a monopoly on electric cars, but they are not making any kind of a profit. And they're certainly not making an economic profit because they're not covering their cost of invested capital and the opportunity cost of the management's time. So let's imagine that Tesla chooses, or any company chooses, QM as its output level because that's where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at that quantity. They go up to the demand curve, but maybe because their cost structure is such that at QM, average total cost is greater than the price, then they would be making an economic loss. So again, just because a company has a monopoly doesn't mean that they are guaranteed to make an economic profit. If the market doesn't like the product they're making, or if the cost of providing that product at the profit maximizing, loss minimizing output level is greater than the price that they can get, then they're not going to be making money. All right, so what's the problem that we have with monopoly? Because monopolies will tend to produce less than the efficient quantity and charge more than the price that would exist in an efficient market supplied by multiple firms. There's this deadweight loss, this triangle, right? So this triangle over here represents the distance between the height of the triangle, or if you like, the length, however you want to look at it, represents the distance between the quantity that the monopolist actually provides and the efficient quantity. And then the base of the triangle, or the height, if you want to call that the height instead, is the difference between the price the monopolist charges and the price that we'd expect, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Remember, in perfect competition, the firm charged a price that was equal to the demand curve, which is also happened to be equal to its marginal revenue curve. So this is a deadweight loss, and the monopolist is able to make themselves better off at society's expense. All right, now we mentioned in part A that some industries get a monopoly provided to them by the government. Mentioned electric companies. Why is it that you can only buy your electricity from one company? It's because the government has basically given one company the exclusive right to sell electricity. Okay, well, why did the government do that? And it's because things like electrical power generation, cable TV, in the old days when we had landline phone services, are believed to be what we call natural monopolies. So what you have to imagine under natural monopoly, let's say we have two identical or maybe 12 identical firms, and let's imagine that each firm has a long run average total cost curve, a U-shaped curve that looks something like this. So what we would like is we would like the firms to produce at the lowest point on their long run average total cost. So that might be over here. Now imagine that the market for this product, let's say it's electricity, is really, really high. Everybody wants electricity. People don't realize how much they want electricity until they don't have it anymore. So let's just imagine that this represents a demand curve for electricity. And let's imagine, though, that people are not willing to pay a really, really high price. I mean, some people might, the maximum price might be this one over here, P max. Okay, so if we have a situation like this, it looks like none of these firms, if they were forced to compete, would be able to provide electricity at a price that's reasonable to consumers, because the lowest possible price over here is higher than the maximum price that a consumer would be willing to pay. Now, if there are declining long run average total cost, then maybe it pays to give this entire industry over to one monopoly. In other words, this is the natural monopoly case. We're saying that this, in things like electrical power generation or landline phone service, if we give it to one company, they can take advantage of these declining long run average total cost curve, the fact that costs are declining over the long run, and then provide it to the market at a price that people are willing to pay. And so, what would prevent that monopolist then from charging the highest price? Well, we could regulate that monopoly, and that's what you see in electrical power generation, for example. I mean, SDG&E may be the only one to supply electricity in San Diego, but if they want a price increase, they have to go to the Public Utilities Commission. Or in the old days with phone service, when there were no cell phones. I know for a lot of you, you can't imagine a day like that. You can't imagine what life must have been like. But back in those days, there was one company, AT&T, that basically controlled every phone call in the United States, but they couldn't charge what they wanted. It was regulated by the federal government. I don't even remember who the regulator was, to be honest with you. All right, so some industries that are characterized, or they say are characterized by natural monopolies: landline phone service, electrical power generation, cable TV. Interestingly, though, cable TV is not really regulated, probably because it's not viewed as being a necessity. Also, the way that it works in most communities is a cable company will say, look, we will, at our own cost, string up everybody's house to cable TV if you give us an exclusive right to an area. In other words, you don't let, Cox will, let's say, ask the people in the county commissioners, to have an area. Maybe it'll be south of the 8 or something like that. That's a Cox area. And Time Warner would not be allowed to compete there. And maybe Time Warner would get everything north of 8 and below the 52 or something, or the 54 or whatever freeway. And so they divide up a geographical area with the blessing of the county commissioners so that they have an exclusive monopoly, because the cable company would say, if you don't give us a monopoly, a geographical monopoly, then it's not worth it for us to try to string cable to every single house in San Diego. Does that make sense? Monopolists as rent seekers. Remember when we were talking about when we were in public choice, we said that rent seeking is an activity where somebody makes themselves better off without necessarily without necessarily making society better off. So an example of a rent seeker would be if I wanted somebody else's money, if I could engage in, let's say, some kind of lobbying or governmental action that would take money away from one person and give it to me, that would be an example of rent seeking, right? So monopolists can do that as well, because monopolists have a lot of power. So some of the things that monopolists do is they'll engage in lobbying. They don't have anybody to compete with in terms of selling the product, so they can maybe lobby the PUC, if you're SDG&E, for a higher rate, become friends with the people on the PUC, maybe give jobs to the people on the PUC after they leave, or they can engage in, public relations or something that would, say, tell the people what a wonderful job they're doing and they deserve to get a higher rate or something like that. And then the idea behind regulatory capture is, maybe what winds up happening is you set up a regulator that's supposed to regulate this industry, and the monopolist is the only firm in the industry. And maybe what the monopolist does is say, well, we can convert this watchdog into a lapdog. Maybe what we'll do is will provide jobs for people who are a regulator after they retire from, government. And so they'll always know that if they are really light in terms of regulation, then they've got a good paying job afterwards. Or maybe they can convince the regulator that they shouldn't allow other firms to come into the industry and compete. Another example of rent-seeking activity. This is actually something that Xerox is famous for doing in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Xerox had a bunch of patents that they had developed on photocopying. And instead of, let's say, filing all those patents at once, what they might do is they might file some patents in one year, some more patents the following year, some more patents a year after that. Why would that be a better strategy? Well, it's a better strategy because as long as any one of those patents can keep someone from entering the market, they extend the amount of time that they have patent protection over photocopying, and they keep other people out of the industry, potential competitors. Or another thing that a monopolist can do is they can engage in all kinds of frivolous lawsuits. Actually, Microsoft was very famous for doing this. They would sue companies out of business. If Microsoft viewed another company as having a technology that was a threat to them, they would bring them to court. Now, why would that be a problem for the company, and why could Microsoft get away with doing that? Well, Microsoft, being a bigger company, had access to more lawyers. These lawyers maybe are sitting around doing very little throughout the day, so if they all of a sudden started suing another company, they'd have something to do. They're getting paid anyway. And this little startup that has this technology, that's trying to develop this technology, doesn't really have the resources to defend itself against a lawsuit. So it's got to do it anyway. So it's got to take some of the resources that it would be putting towards their technology into defending themselves against this lawsuit. And it ties up a lot of management time and the rest. And then they maybe wind up getting sued out of business. There were lots of companies that complained about that. Lots of companies in the software space when Microsoft was more of an aggressive company. So this is an example of anti-competitive behavior by Mattel, the maker of Barbie. A few years ago, another company came up with a thing called the Bratz doll, MGA, and they started making inroads into Barbie's, taking away market share. And so one of the things Mattel did was they said, well, why don't we talk to the people over there at this company called MGA? They're the maker of Bratz, and let's tell them that we want to buy their company. But in order for us to buy their company, we have to take a look at their marketing and their business plan and everything else. And so I guess MGA thought, that might not be a bad idea. I mean, if they want to go ahead and buy us, that might be a quick way of cashing out. Well, so Mattel looked at MGA and then they said, we're not interested. And after they had a look at what their plan was. Now, MGA took Mattel to court and they got an award for 88.4 million from Mattel because they showed that Mattel was not really negotiating in good faith. So would it be worth 88.4 million to Mattel to find out what they're doing over at MGA with Bratz? And the answer is perhaps. I mean, I don't know how much Barbie is worth to Mattel, but it might be that, Barbie is such a big seller and they're worried about this threat coming from MGA that, they might it might be worth it to pay this much money to find out what MGA's strategy is all about. All right, I'll pick it up over here next time, and so we'll talk about the difference between a single price monopolist and a monopolist that is able to engage in price discrimination.